The sun was just beginning to set over the quiet suburban neighborhood. In the distance, the sound of children playing echoed down the street, while birds chirped happily from the trees. It was a typical evening, peaceful and calm. For the protagonist, life was simple. They lived in a small house at the end of the street, surrounded by friendly neighbors and the occasional passerby. Everything in their life was routine, a balance of work, relaxation, and time spent outdoors. But one morning, as they stepped outside to check the mail, something felt off. The mailbox, a simple wooden structure that had stood proudly by their front gate for years, had been knocked over. At first, they thought it was just a random accident. Maybe it had been hit by a car or some careless delivery driver. They stood there for a moment, staring at the mailbox, not sure what to make of the situation. After inspecting it closely, they noticed the damage was far too deliberate to be caused by a mere accident. The wooden post had been snapped in half, and the metal door was bent out of shape, as though someone had deliberately kicked or hit it. It was clear now. This wasn't an accident. Someone had destroyed their mailbox on purpose. The protagonist felt a rush of frustration, but tried to remain calm. Maybe it's just kids messing around, they thought. But even so, it didn't sit right with them. They couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't as it seemed. They decided to repair the mailbox themselves, not wanting to waste time waiting for a repairman. It was a small job, and they figured it was no big deal. They went to the hardware store, picked up a replacement post, and fixed it in place. As they worked, they couldn't help but wonder who would do such a thing. Sure, the neighborhood had its fair share of petty disagreements, but no one had ever done something so obvious, so personal. It left the protagonist with a sense of unease that wouldn't go away. The next day, as the protagonist left for work, they noticed something that made their stomach drop. The mailbox was smashed again. This time, it wasn't just knocked over. It was completely destroyed. The wood had been splintered, and the metal had been twisted beyond recognition. Someone had taken the time to destroy it. Once again, their hearts sank, and a feeling of helplessness washed over them. Who could be doing this? With no clue as to who was behind it, the protagonist started to feel a little paranoid. They began to wonder if this was some kind of prank, or if someone in the neighborhood had a problem with them. At first, they tried to laugh it off, but the situation was starting to get more and more serious. A small part of them felt anger bubbling inside, and they realized they couldn't just let this go on. Something had to be done. But what? They needed answers. They needed to know who was behind this, and they needed it to stop before things got worse. In the back of their mind, the protagonist couldn't shake one question. Why would someone target them in such a way? They didn't know anyone who would go to such lengths. There was no obvious reason for anyone to act out like this. But deep down, they could feel that this was only the beginning, and they had no idea how far things could escalate. Little did they know, the real trouble was only just getting started. Days passed, and the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After the second destruction of their mailbox, they found themselves growing more and more frustrated. It wasn't just about the mailbox anymore. It was the fact that someone somewhere was doing this on purpose, and no matter what they did, it kept happening. Every time they repaired the mailbox, it was destroyed again, like clockwork. It felt like a personal attack, but who could it be? They had no idea. At first, the protagonist considered that it might be some kind of prank. Maybe kids in the neighborhood were just getting a kick out of it, thinking it was funny to destroy something small and insignificant. But deep down, they knew it was more than that. Whoever was doing this wasn't just messing around. They were intentionally causing harm. They couldn't shake the suspicion that it was someone who lived nearby, someone who knew them or had a reason for targeting them. But who? The protagonist decided it was time to take a closer look at their neighbors. They began paying more attention to the people around them, watching for any sign of suspicious behavior. The neighbors on the left were an older couple who kept to themselves. They didn't seem like the type to pull a prank or destroy someone's property. The ones on the right were friendly, always waving and saying hello, but they were also out of town quite a lot for work. Still, they didn't seem like the kind of people who would intentionally ruin someone's day. Then there was Karen, the neighbor across the street. She was known to be a bit difficult. The protagonist had heard rumors about her over the years. She was outspoken, often involved in heated arguments with people in the neighborhood about trivial things. She didn't always follow the rules and had a tendency to demand special treatment. The protagonist hadn't had much interaction with her personally, but the few times they'd crossed paths, Karen had always seemed a little too eager to make her opinion known. One afternoon, as the protagonist was inspecting the latest damage to their mailbox, they noticed Karen standing at the edge of her yard, watching them. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, her arms crossed, as if she was observing. The protagonist couldn't help but feel that she was watching with more than just casual interest. The way she was standing, the way she was staring. It was as if she knew exactly what had been happening and was just waiting to see what the protagonist would do next. There was something about her expression that made the protagonist uneasy. The next day, the protagonist decided they had to confront Karen. They couldn't just sit back and let this continue without finding out what was really going on. They walked over to her house, taking a deep breath before knocking on her door. When Karen answered, she greeted them with a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. The protagonist tried to keep their voice steady as they asked if she had noticed anything strange happening to their mailbox. Karen was quick to deny any involvement, but her defensiveness only made the protagonist more suspicious. "I don't know what you're talking about," Karen said, almost too quickly. "Why would I have anything to do with that?" But the protagonist could tell there was something off about her tone, something that didn't quite add up. The conversation didn't last long, and Karen quickly excused herself, saying she had things to do. As the protagonist walked back to their house, they couldn't help but feel that Karen was hiding something. There was no way to be sure, but the way she acted, it was as if she was guilty. The protagonist's suspicions were growing stronger, and they had a feeling that they were getting closer to uncovering the truth. That night, as they sat in their living room, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They were becoming more and more convinced that Karen was behind it all. And if that was true, they would have to find a way to put a stop to it once and for all. But what could they do? The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for the protagonist. They couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that Karen, the neighbor across the street, was behind the destruction of their mailbox. The more they thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. Karen's strange behavior, her defensiveness when confronted, it all pointed in her direction. But there was still no concrete proof. The protagonist didn't want to accuse someone without being sure, but the constant damage to their mailbox had pushed them to their limit. One evening, as they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, the protagonist made a decision. They had to confront Karen again. But this time, they would be more direct. No more beating around the bush, no more subtle hints. They needed answers, and they needed them now. As the last of the daylight faded, the protagonist stood up and walked across the street toward Karen's house. Karen's house was quiet, the lights off in most of the windows, giving the feeling that she wasn't home. But the protagonist didn't let that stop them. They knocked on the door, their heart pounding in their chest as they waited for an answer. Moments later, Karen appeared, her face a little more guarded than usual, as if she'd been expecting them. "What do you want?" Karen asked, her tone colder than it had been the last time they spoke. The protagonist tried to remain calm, despite the anger rising inside them. "I know it's you, Karen. You've been destroying my mailbox, and I want you to stop." Karen's expression didn't change, but the protagonist could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe annoyance. It was hard to tell. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but the protagonist didn't let her. "I don't know why you're doing this, but I'm not going to put up with it anymore." This has gone on long enough. Karen stared at them, almost sizing them up before she finally spoke. You really think I would do something like that? You've got it all wrong. I've been busy with my own stuff, and I haven't had time to mess with your mailbox. The words sounded rehearsed, too quick to be believable. The protagonist knew she was lying, but they needed proof, something concrete to prove that Karen was the one behind it all. The conversation didn't last long. Karen dismissed them with a few short words, and the protagonist walked back across the street, more certain than ever that she was the one responsible. That night, as they lay in bed, the protagonist thought about what to do next. They couldn't just let Karen get away with it, but they didn't know how to catch her in the act. The police had already been involved, but they couldn't prove anything. The protagonist was starting to feel like there was no way out of this cycle. Every time they fixed the mailbox, it was destroyed again. It was maddening. They couldn't keep living like this. As the days went by, the protagonist decided to take matters into their own hands. They couldn't rely on anyone else to help, and they couldn't just keep fixing the mailbox every time it got destroyed. They had to find a way to stop Karen once and for all. And so the plan began to form in their mind. A plan that would involve a lot more than just confronting Karen. It was time to take control of the situation and show Karen that the protagonist wasn't going to back down. But what could they do? How far would they go to put an end to this once and for all? The protagonist didn't know yet, but they were ready to find out. The protagonist's frustration was reaching its breaking point. After confronting Karen and getting nowhere, they felt more helpless than ever. They had tried everything they could think of, talking to Karen, calling the authorities, but nothing had worked. The mailbox was still being destroyed, and they were stuck in a never-ending cycle of repairs. The situation felt hopeless, and the protagonist started to wonder if there was any way out of this at all. In the midst of their growing frustration, they decided to take a more serious step. Maybe, just maybe, they could take legal action. They thought about it long and hard, and while it seemed like a drastic move, it was clear that they couldn't just keep dealing with this forever. The damage wasn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. It was a matter of principle. Someone was intentionally ruining their property, and that wasn't something they could let slide. The protagonists spent the next few days looking into their options. They researched what steps they could take to hold Karen accountable, even if it meant going to court. It wasn't something they ever imagined doing, but the constant mailbox destruction had gone on for far too long. They even reached out to a local lawyer for advice. The lawyer confirmed that if they could prove Karen was behind the destruction, they might be able to take legal action and potentially get compensation for the damages. At this point, the protagonist felt like they were running out of choices. They didn't want to escalate the situation too much, but they couldn't just let it continue. After all, a mailbox might seem like a small thing to some people, but to the protagonist, it was a symbol of their home, of their sense of security. The thought that someone was intentionally attacking that made them feel unsafe and powerless. The lawyer suggested they start by gathering evidence. You'll need to prove that Karen is the one doing this, they said. Without evidence, you won't have much of a case. The advice was sound, but it left the protagonist wondering how they could possibly gather that kind of proof. The mailbox was always destroyed when no one was around to witness it. There were no cameras on the street, no direct evidence to point the finger at Karen. It was clear that proving Karen's involvement wouldn't be easy. The protagonist felt stuck again. They didn't have the money or resources for a lengthy legal battle, especially when they had no hard evidence. Even if they could get a lawyer to represent them, it was hard to see how they could actually win the case. It was starting to feel like they were up against a brick wall, and nothing was going to break it down. As the days went by, the protagonist continued to patch up their mailbox, each time growing more discouraged. Karen's attitude hadn't changed. She still acted as though nothing was happening, and the protagonist began to feel as though they were fighting the losing battle. The situation was starting to take a toll on them, affecting their mood and how they saw their neighborhood. The peaceful, friendly environment they once loved was now tinged with tension and resentment. But the thought of letting Karen win, of letting her continue to get away with destroying their property, was something the protagonist couldn't accept. They knew they had to keep pushing forward, even if they didn't know exactly how to win. They were determined to put an end to this, no matter how difficult it was. It was clear the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but the protagonist was finally ready to take the next step in their fight for justice. The question now was, what could they do next? As the days passed, the protagonist's frustration continued to grow. They had tried everything they could think of, talking to Karen, contacting the authorities, even looking into legal action, but nothing seemed to work. The mailbox kept getting destroyed over and over again, like a cruel joke that never seemed to end. The damage wasn't just physical anymore. It was starting to wear them down mentally and emotionally. The quiet neighborhood they once enjoyed was now a source of stress, and the idea of facing Karen again made their stomach churn. One evening, after yet another frustrating day of repairing the mailbox, the protagonists sat down on their porch, feeling defeated. They stared at the twisted remains of the mailbox they had just fixed, their mind racing. It was clear that no one was taking this seriously. The authorities weren't doing enough, and Karen was still walking around like nothing was wrong. It was a bitter feeling. The knowledge that they were powerless, that their property and their peace of mind were being constantly violated, with no real way to stop it. But then, as the protagonist sat there, a new thought began to form in their mind. What if they stopped fixing the mailbox entirely? What if they just stopped repairing it every time it was destroyed? Maybe that would send a message. Maybe, if Karen saw that the mailbox wasn't being replaced anymore, she would realize that her actions had consequences. It wasn't much, but at least it was something. The idea was small, but it was a start. The protagonist didn't want to just let Karen get away with it, but they also didn't want to keep spending time and money fixing something that would be destroyed again. So they decided to take a different approach. Instead of rebuilding the mailbox, they would let the damage sit there, unfinished, as a symbol of their frustration and defiance. The next day, when the protagonist went outside, they saw Karen walking by, as usual. This time, however, the protagonist didn't go inside to start working on the mailbox. They stayed on the porch, watching quietly as Karen passed. Karen didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. But the protagonist was determined to stand their ground. If Karen wanted to keep smashing the mailbox, fine, but they wouldn't be fixing it anymore. As the days went by, the protagonist noticed that Karen seemed to take more interest in the broken mailbox. She would walk by it more frequently, staring at it with what seemed like a hint of curiosity or even annoyance. The protagonist couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. It wasn't much, but it was a way to push back without having to engage in another useless confrontation. The plan seemed to be working, but it wasn't without its challenges. The mailbox, now a broken shell of its former self, sat in front of the house like a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Every time the protagonist looked at it, they felt the weight of the situation pressing down on them. But they didn't want to back down. They had to stand firm. Despite the small progress, the protagonist knew that simply leaving the mailbox broken wouldn't be enough to stop Karen. They were sure Karen had noticed by now, but would that be enough? The protagonist had no idea what Karen's next move would be, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over yet. The situation wasn't going to resolve itself just by leaving the mailbox in ruins. It felt like something bigger was brewing, and the protagonist wasn't sure how far they were willing to go to make it stop. But one thing was certain: they weren't going to give up so easily. They were done being pushed around. The battle wasn't over yet, but they were ready for whatever came next. Days turned into weeks, and the protagonist's decision to leave the broken mailbox alone was starting to show some unexpected results. Karen seemed to be more aware of the mailbox now, often walking by it and giving it lingering stares. The protagonist couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of victory. They had stood firm and decided not to repair it anymore, But it wasn't like the mailbox was suddenly safe. In fact, the situation felt just as tense as before, like an unresolved standoff that was slowly simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the protagonist started considering a different kind of solution. The broken mailbox had now become a symbol of frustration, of anger, and of defiance. But it wasn't enough to simply leave it there and hope Karen would stop. The protagonist knew that if they wanted to truly end this, they would need to do something more permanent, something that would put an end to Karen's destructive behavior for good. And so, a new idea began to form in their mind. What if they replaced the mailbox entirely, not just with another regular one, but with something so strong, so secure, that Karen wouldn't even be able to damage it? The more the protagonist thought about it, the more the idea appealed to them. Why not build something that would send a message, loud and clear? A mailbox that was indestructible, something that would make Karen realize that they weren't going to be an easy target anymore. The protagonist wasted no time. They started making plans, sketching out ideas for a new, far more durable mailbox. The project would require more than just some spare wood and nails. It would need metal, something solid that could withstand anything Karen might throw at it. The idea of using steel for the structure was both practical and symbolic. Steel was tough, unyielding, and would stand as a representation of the protagonist's own determination to put an end to this madness. The following weekend, the protagonist set off for the local hardware store. They bought several pieces of metal, along with other tools needed for the construction. As they stood in the store, they couldn't help but feel a growing sense of excitement. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about taking control of the situation and not allowing Karen to have the upper hand. It felt empowering to finally be doing something proactive rather than just reacting to the damage. Back home, the protagonist began working on the steel mailbox. It took time, and there were moments of frustration, but with every piece that came together, they could feel their sense of purpose growing stronger. The metal mailbox began to take shape, far more sturdy and imposing than the old wooden one ever could have been. The protagonist took care to make sure every part of it was secure and well built, paying attention to the details. This wasn't just a repair, it was a statement. As the mailbox neared completion, the protagonist felt a sense of accomplishment they hadn't experienced in a while. They stood back, looking at the result of their hard work. Solid steel, reinforced, and capable of withstanding any attack. This was something Karen couldn't destroy, and for the first time in weeks, the protagonist felt hopeful again. But there was still the matter of Karen. The protagonist didn't know how she would react when she saw the new mailbox, but they were certain it would be unlike anything she expected. This steel structure wasn't just about protecting the mail anymore. It was about sending a message. The protagonist was done being pushed around. They weren't going to let anyone, not even Karen, dictate their peace of mind. Now, with the steel mailbox standing proudly at the edge of their property, the protagonist was ready for whatever came next. They had taken a stand, and they knew that no matter what Karen tried, this time, it wouldn't be so easy for her. The battle wasn't over yet, but the protagonist was finally feeling like they had the upper hand. The day the steel mailbox was finally completed, the protagonist stood in front of it, feeling a strange sense of pride mixed with anticipation. The mailbox, now standing tall and solid, looked more like a small fortress than something designed to hold letters. The gleaming steel reflected the sunlight, making it look almost unapproachable, as though it was daring anyone to try and destroy it. The protagonist had put in hours of hard work, and the satisfaction of creating something so strong and secure filled them with a quiet confidence. But as much as they were proud of their creation, there was still one more part of this ordeal left to face: Karen. The protagonist couldn't help but wonder how she would react when she saw it. They had no doubt she would be furious. She had made it clear through her actions that she wasn't going to let something as simple as a mailbox stand in her way. But this time, things were different. The protagonist had taken matters into their own hands, and they weren't going to back down. Later that afternoon, As the protagonist was sitting on their porch, they noticed Karen coming down the street, walking with her usual brisk pace. The moment Karen spotted the new steel mailbox, her steps faltered for just a split second. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and the protagonist could practically see the gears turning in her head as she processed the sight of the unmovable structure. She stopped in her tracks and stared at it, her jaw tightening. The protagonist couldn't help but smile slightly. They knew that this was the moment Karen realized they had done something she couldn't simply walk away from. Karen slowly walked closer, her gaze still fixed on the steel mailbox. The protagonist stood up, not wanting to show any signs of weakness. They waited, watching as Karen finally reached the edge of their property. She stood there for a long moment, her arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The tension in the air was palpable. The protagonist had no idea what Karen was thinking, but they could sense her frustration. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice tight with annoyance. "You've got to be kidding me. Is this really necessary?" The protagonist stayed calm, not allowing themselves to get rattled. "It's necessary if you keep smashing my mailbox. I've had enough." Karen scoffed, shaking her head. "You think this is going to stop me? It's just a mailbox. Who cares?" The protagonist's eyes didn't leave hers. "It's not just a mailbox. It's about respect. You've been destroying my property, and I've had enough of it. This is the last time." For a moment, Karen didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at the steel mailbox, as if weighing her options. The protagonist could see the gears turning in her mind, but they weren't about to back down. They weren't afraid of whatever Karen was planning next. This was their stand, and they were ready to defend it. Karen, still glaring at the mailbox, muttered something under her breath before turning around and storming back to her house. The protagonist watched her go, feeling a small sense of victory, but also a little bit of unease. It wasn't over. They knew Karen wouldn't just walk away quietly. But for now, the protagonist had done what they could to protect their property, and that felt like a small victory in itself. Over the next few days, the protagonist kept a close eye on the mailbox, watching for any sign that Karen might try to destroy it. But to their surprise, the mailbox remained untouched. There were no attempts to smash it, no signs of vandalism. It was almost as if Karen had given up. Maybe, just maybe, the steel wall they had built had sent the message loud and clear. Or maybe Karen realized that she couldn't win this battle. The protagonist didn't know for sure, but one thing was clear: things had changed. They had stood up for themselves in a way they never thought they would, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like they had regained control. The tension in the air had finally started to lift, and though they were still wary of what might come next, they were ready to face it head-on. It was a quiet evening when the protagonist sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The steel mailbox stood proudly at the edge of their yard, undisturbed. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a symbol of their strength, their determination, and their refusal to let anyone walk all over them. The battle with Karen was far from over, but for now, the protagonist felt a peace they hadn't felt in weeks. And that was enough. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. The protagonist found themselves looking out the window more often, glancing at the steel mailbox as if waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Karen, as if she had vanished from the scene, didn't make any attempts to destroy the mailbox again. The mailbox stood there, unscathed and proud, as a clear sign that the protagonist had finally taken control of the situation. It wasn't that the protagonist had won a huge battle, but in a way they had. Karen hadn't physically attacked the mailbox again, and the protagonist had sent a message that was far stronger than they had expected. They had learned that standing up for themselves, not backing down, could sometimes be enough to make a person reconsider their actions. Still, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. There was always a chance that Karen might try something else. The protagonist knew better than to be too confident. Weeks went by without any more incidents, and life slowly started to return to normal. The tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud was gone, replaced by an odd sense of calm. It was like the protagonist had pushed through the worst of it, and now they could finally breathe. The mailbox, though, still remained a symbol, a reminder of the strength they had found in themselves during the ordeal. Every time they walked outside, they couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride when they saw it. Karen, too, seemed to have backed off. The protagonist saw her walking past their house a few times, but she never stopped, never gave them another look. It was as if she had decided to leave things alone, perhaps because she realized the protagonist wasn't someone to be trifled with. It wasn't clear why Karen had stopped, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the protagonist was no longer the victim of petty vandalism. They had found their voice and used it to protect what was theirs. One evening, as the protagonist sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the sky, they thought about how much had changed. The sense of vulnerability they had once felt every time they stepped outside and saw the damage to their mailbox had shifted into something else. They felt stronger now, not just because of the steel mailbox they had built, but because they had taken a stand and refused to let someone push them around. It was a small victory, but it felt like a turning point in their life. It wasn't just about the mailbox anymore. It was about asserting their right to peace, to a quiet life without fear of constant destruction. The protagonist realized that, in a way, this had been a lesson in resilience. They had stood up for themselves when it would have been easy to ignore the problem or just accept it. And by doing that, they had regained control, not just over the mailbox, but over their own sense of security and well-being. Though things had quieted down, the protagonist didn't forget the experience. Every time they passed the steel mailbox, they were reminded of how far they had come. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a symbol of their strength and determination. And even if Karen never returned to vandalize their property again, the protagonist knew that they would always be ready to stand their ground when necessary. The neighborhood, once filled with tension and uncertainty, had become peaceful once more. The protagonist felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that they had put an end to the cycle of frustration. The steel mailbox stood as a reminder of their victory, a mark of resilience and a symbol of how, sometimes, standing up for yourself can change everything. As the protagonists settled back into their daily routine, they couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. They had learned an important lesson during this ordeal, that they didn't have to be afraid to stand up for what was right. And as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, they couldn't help but smile, knowing that no matter what came next, they were ready to face it with confidence. The mailbox had served its purpose, and in the end, the protagonist had found a strength they hadn't known they had.